naked a lot. How does that feel? Is that something when they write you into the script, do they say, hey, how do you feel about being naked? Or you just all of a sudden are surprised, like, oh, I have to be naked?
You kind of, you have no choice.
This is a pretty uncomfortable video to make up to this point. If anyone were to check my browser history, there would be some questionable searches for sure. But you know, this topic has been on my mind for so long now that I just felt it absolutely necessary to put forth and make. It seems that nudity within films is at an all-time high. Granted, I'm only 28, so I wasn't around during the 80s, during those heavily explicit films that were made. I mean, they were literally showing like full frontal nudity, both men and women. Even one of my favorite actors, Mark Wahlberg, has a very famous scene.
So I'm gonna be nice. Oh, I'm a star, I'm a star. I am a big, bright, shining star.
Now, I say we're at an all-time high, knowing full well that over the course of human history, the moral pendulum has swayed back and forth from overly explicit to overly censored. So forgive me for my lack of first-hand experience. But for my own personal viewing, it's getting harder and harder to find a streaming series or a film that does not contain nudity. Now, I know what you must be thinking, like, hey, who's this prude, right? Like, what's wrong with nudity? And truth be told, there's nothing wrong with nudity. I mean, there's nothing wrong. To me, the issue at hand is not nudity in a vacuum, it's the misuse, unneeded, forcefully interwoven nudity that brings no value of story, emotion, or character development. Now, just to prove my point that I don't think all nudity is bad, let me give you a case study of nudity within cinema that I thought was actually well placed and justified. Season 1, Episode 1 of Ozark. Don't worry, if you haven't seen the show, I won't have any spoilers here. But in Episode 1, we see the protagonist, Marty Byrde, played by Jason Bateman, watching a hidden camera sex tape of his wife Wendy, played by Laura Linney, having an affair with another man. Now, as far as nudity goes, we don't actually see that much of it, but it is very clear what is happening and what is going on. Now, when I first started watching this show years ago, before really all the hype and the clout surrounding it, I was immediately just thrown off and taken back by this scene. So much so that I actually just stopped watching it altogether. And then after I kept reading about all the reviews and different people saying how beautifully executed this show was, I kind of just said to myself, hey, maybe if I get through that first episode, the nudity will just kind of taper off through the rest of the season and the rest of the show. So I came back and, of course, like any great show, I just binged it all the way through its current season. I was wrong about one thing, however. The nudity did not taper off. But we'll get to that later. After I had spent time and gone through the entire show and I developed context for what takes place in the pilot, I realized how beautifully done the explicit content was. That scene in Marty's office was so unbelievably uncomfortable for me, and that's exactly what the writers, program creators, and directors of the show intended. Now, I don't think they ever intended for me to take a year hiatus of the show, but they wanted to set the stage from the very onset of the relationship and the power dynamic between Marty and his wife Wendy. Because when you understand their relationship and the complexities of it, everything that happens thereafter, it's not that it is justified, but you can start to make sense of this chaotic world that Ozark takes place in. A theme that plays throughout the entire show, one that was so deeply infused into the veins of the story, beyond the drugs, murders, cartel involvement, this show at its core is about a very complicated family and marital structure.
Marty, what would it look like to achieve your objectives without interfering with Wendy's project?
I think that would look like death.
But what would it really look like?
Really death.
Now, let's get into some examples of nudity within cinema that I do not feel were justified, ones that just overall were not integral to the story whatsoever. But before we get into that, I actually want to ask you a question, and it's not a rhetorical question. Like, feel free to leave your answers in the comments. But I just wonder, has anybody ever, watched a movie or a streaming series and you were coming out of the theater or you're turning off the app? Have you ever thought to yourself, like, man, that was a great show, or that was a really good movie, but I just wish there was a little bit more nudity. That would have taken it over the top. Like, for me personally, I never have. But I'll just leave it at that. You let me know what you think down below. Let's get into some examples. All right, I told you we'd be back to Ozark. So, much to my demise, in season 1 of Ozark, the nudity did not taper off as I was hoping. We see more examples of Marty when his family moved to the Ozarks, and we see multiple scenes of Marty and other characters in a strip club. What I wish would have happened, much like they did with the Wendy affair, was to show the explicit content without actually showing the explicit content. One of the greatest things that I think you can do as a writer or as a director is let your viewer, let your audience's imagination run wild. Let your viewer figure out what is happening without blatantly telling them what is happening. Now I get it. They're in a strip club, and this club throughout the first 2 seasons plays a role. But it's very easy to identify a strip club without actually needing to see the dancers. Now there's one last study that I want to visit before we get into the conclusion of this video. There have been several shows and movies that have become popular over the years, from Riverdale, Twilight, 13 Reasons Why, and as of recently, Euphoria. And all of these shows and movies have one thing in common, that the actors and actresses playing these roles are acting as teenagers, characters ranging anywhere from 15 to 17 or 18 years old. Let's take Riverdale for an example. Riverdale is one of my favorite shows actually that I've watched in the last few years. And it pains me to my very soul whenever these shows and films include nudity and sex scenes. Thankfully in Riverdale, we don't actually see a ton of nudity, however, we do see several suggested sex scenes. I think you know where I'm going with this, but so often these films and these shows are literally portraying teenagers having sex. And in one of these most recent shows, Euphoria, I've actually not watched it, I've only read the reviews, so again, I might be a little ignorant on this particular show, but from my understanding, I mean, they are showing full frontal nudity of people pretending to be teenagers. Now, where I come from, teenage nudity is called child pornography, and that's illegal. And I know I'm being dramatic here, but it seems like at times, especially in Riverdale, we go from one scene of Betty Cooper needing to ask her mom to go hang out with her friends, and in the next, she's losing her virginity. And we're just watching it like, yep, that's a good show. And I get it. High schoolers having sex is nothing new, but that doesn't mean that I condone it. And honestly, it pains me when I watch these shows and TV and cinema, they are promoting it. They're not only condoning it, they're glorifying it, encouraging it, and in a lot of ways supporting it. By now, you probably know how I feel on the subject. And yes, in case you were wondering, I am religious, I am a Christian, and yes, I do my best to follow a certain set of morals and values. But this video has really nothing to do with my faith or me standing on some sort of moral podium casting stones down on other people. This essay was meant to provoke thoughts, feelings, and emotions, and most importantly to ask the question, why? And maybe even a better question is how much, as in how much nudity is enough. As I stated earlier in the video, I'm not against nudity or the human body. I think in the right context, the naked body is one of the most amazing things that we have. We are so exposed. Everything, and I mean everything, is about sex, it seems. I cannot scroll on my timeline for more than a few minutes without seeing something that I didn't necessarily want to see. And And what's really scary is the impact that it's having on our young people today. Youth are being exposed to sex and nudity more in their short lives than many well-aged adults before them. To some, this is no issue. To me, I think it is. And I think sadly, cinema, something that I love so dearly, something that has inspired me to such great lengths, is responsible for this overstimulation and desensitization. The pendulum has clearly swung to the side of overexposure. My only hope is for time to take its course and for the pendulum to slowly come back to even ground. But we'll see if that day ever comes, because whether it's being shown, suggested, talked about, discussed, or even in this video, criticized, at the end of the day, sex sells.